Hello, my dear students. Today I will be discussing about reservoirs, Unit 2. Let us see what is reservoir. A reservoir is an area developed by water body due to construction of dam. Dams are constructed across the rivers and streams to create an artificial lake or reservoir behind it. Water storage reservoirs may be created by constructing a dam across the river along with suitable appurtenant structures. Further, reservoirs are also meant to absorb a part of floodwater and the excess is discharged through a spillway. Dams and reservoirs are the most important and expensive elements in multi-purpose river basin development. They require very careful planning, design and operation. A number of problems arise in design, construction and operation of dams and reservoirs. It is also essential to study the relationship between the flood discharge, reservoir's capacity, and spillway size in order to propose an economic solution to the whole project. This you can see, this is a storage reservoir. Fundamentally, a reservoir serves to store water and the size of the reservoir is governed by the volume of the water that must be stored, which in turn is affected by the variability of the inflow available for the reservoir. Reservoirs are of two main categories. The first one is impounding reservoirs into which a river flows naturally. Second one is service or balancing reservoirs. Here, the reservoirs receiving supplies that are pumped or channeled into them artificially. Okay, so two types. The first one is impounding reservoirs. Here, river flows naturally, and reservoirs. These are the reservoirs into which a river flows naturally. Second one is balancing reservoirs or servicing reservoirs. Here, these reservoirs receives the supplies that are pumped or channeled artificially. In general, service or balancing reservoirs are required to balance supply with demand. Reservoirs of the second type are relatively small in volume because the storage required by them is to balance flows for a few hours or a few days at the most. Impounding or storage reservoirs are intended to accumulate a part of the flood flow of the river for use during the non-flood months. These are some of the purpose of the storage reservoirs. That is, the storage main things are the irrigation purpose, means storage and control of water for irrigation, storage and diversion of water for domestic uses, water supplies for industrial uses, development of hydroelectric power, increasing water depths for navigation, storage space for flood control, reclamation of low-lying lands, debris control, preservation and cultivation of useful aquatic life and recreation. Some functions of reservoirs in detail. That is, first one is human consumption and or industrial use. Then irrigation, usually to supplement insufficient rainfall, then hydropower to generate power and energy whenever water is available or to provide reliable supplies of power and energy at all times when needed to meet demand. Then flood control, storage capacity is required to be maintained to absorb foreseeable flood inflows to the reservoirs so far as they would cause excess of acceptable discharge spillway opening. Storage allows future use of the flood water retained. Then amenity use. This may include provision for boating, water sports, fishing, sightseeing, etc. Then pumped storage hydropower schemes in which the water flows from an upper to lower reservoir, generating power and energy at times of high demand through turbines, which may be reversible, and the water is pumped back to the upper reservoir when surplus energy is available. The cycle is usually daily or twice daily to meet the peak demands. Inflow to such a reservoir is not essential provided it is required to replace water losses through leakage and evaporation or to generate additional electricity. In such facilities, the power stations, conduits, and either or both of the reservoirs could be constructed underground if it was found to do so. Next, let us see some of the classification of reservoirs based on the purpose served. There are four types mainly: storage or conservation reservoirs, flood protection reservoirs, distribution reservoirs, and multipurpose reservoirs. Let us see one by one. The first one is storage reservoirs. Storage reservoirs are primarily used for water supplies for irrigation, hydroelectric development, domestic and industrial supplies. These storage reservoirs are also called as conservation reservoirs because they are used to conserve water. Storage reservoirs are constructed to store the water in the rainy season and to release it later when the river flow is low. A river does not carry the same quantity of water throughout the year and may carry large quantities in the other part of the year. A storage reservoir is constructed to store the excess water during the period of large supplies and release it gradually as and when it is needed. This is about storage reservoirs. Let us see the second type, that is flood control reservoirs. A flood control reservoir is constructed for the purpose of flood control. It protects the areas lying on its downstream side from the damages due to flood. Flood control or flood protection reservoirs are those which store water during flood and release it gradually at a safe rate when the flood reduces. By the provision of artificial storage during the floods, flood damage downstream is reduced. A reservoir wherein water is stored for a relatively brief period of time, past of it being retained until the stream can safely carry the ordinary flow plus the released water. Such reservoirs usually have outlets without control gates and are used for flood regulation. These reservoirs are also called as retarding reservoir. Next, third one is distribution reservoirs. A distribution reservoir is a small storage reservoir to tide over the peak demand of water for municipal water supply or irrigation. The distribution reservoir accounts for the varying rate of water during the day. Such distribution reservoir permits the pumping plants and water treatment works, etc., to operate at a constant rate. The varying demand rate exceeding to constant pumping rate is met from the distribution reservoir. The distribution reservoir is helpful in permitting the pumps to work at a uniform rate. Okay. A reservoir connected with distribution system, a water supply project used primarily to care for fluctuations in demand which occur over short periods and as local storage in case of emergency such as a break in a main supply line, failure of a pumping plant. Last one is the multipurpose reservoirs. As the name itself it indicates, it is constructed for the multipurposes. A reservoir planned and constructed to serve not only one purpose but various purposes together is called a multipurpose reservoir. These are constructed for more than single purpose. A multipurpose reservoir is a man-made lake which is managed for multiple purposes. A reservoir constructed and equipped to provide storage and release of water for two or more purposes such as irrigation, flood control, power generation, navigation, pollution abatement, soil erosion, domestic and industrial water supply, fish culture, recreation, etc. You can see this is a multi-purpose reservoir. Next, investigations for reservoir planning. The following investigations are required for reservoir planning. The first one is engineering surveys, second one is geological investigations, and third one is hydrological investigations. Let us see one by one. The first one is engineering surveys. The area at the dam site is surveyed in detail and a contour plan is prepared. From the plan, the different physical characteristics are to be prepared, that is area elevation curve, storage elevation curve, map of the area to indicate the land property to be surveyed. The horizontal control is usually provided by triangulation survey and the vertical control by precise leveling. The second one is geological investigation. Geological investigations of the dam and reservoir site are done for the following purposes. The first one is for the suitability of foundation for the dam, water tightness of the reservoir basin, location of the quarry sites for the construction materials. In almost all major civil engineering projects, geological advice is the most essential. Geological investigations cost very little in comparison to the total cost of the project. In a number of cases in recent years, it has amounted to between 1/4 to 1% of the whole. This relatively small amount represents a valuable insurance against expensive difficulties otherwise unforeseen which might arise during construction, but which it may be possible to predict from a study of the geological factors involved. Geological investigations are required to give detailed information about the following items. As I already told, that is water tightness of the reservoir basin and suitability of the foundation for the dam, then geological and structural features such as folds, faults, fissures, etc. of the rocks basin, then type and depth of the overburden, and location of permeable and soluble rocks, if any, groundwater conditions in the region, location of the same thing, quarry size for the construction materials. The geology of the catchment area should also be studied since it affects the proportions of runoff percolation. The special requirement for the geology of the reservoir site is that there should be no danger of serious leakage when the ground is under pressure from the full head of the water in the reservoir. The geology of the dam site is important from the point of view of secure foundation for the dam. The nature of subsurface geology should be explored by trial bores or various means of geophysical exploration. Next, let us see about hydrological investigation. The hydrological investigation is a very important aspect of reservoir planning. The capacity of the irrigation canals and or the installed capacity of the powerhouses will depend upon the available supplies from the reservoir. The hydrological investigations may be divided into two heads. The first one is supply of runoff pattern at the proposed dam site to determine the storage capacity corresponding to the given demand, and the determination of the hydrograph of the worst flood to determine the spillway capacity and design. Next, let us see what are the requirements for a site selection. Large capacity, storage capacity, river valley should be narrow, length of the dam to construct it is less, water tightness of the reservoir, good hydrological condition, deep reservoir, small submerged area, low silt inflow, no objectionable minerals, a low cost of real estate, site easily accessible. I hope all of you understood. Thank